Um, so it's, like I said, a great pleasure. We have a fantastic speaker today. Dr. Corey Callaghan is assistant professor at University of Florida in the Wildlife Ecology and Conservation Department and based at the Fort Lauderdale Campus and Education Center. We were first in touch a couple months ago when he contacted me. He had a potential postdoc who was interested in writing Smith Fellowship grant, the Society for Conservation Biology's postdoctoral fellowship. That student ended up getting a full-time job somewhere else and took off, but we have continued chatting, and it's been really fun. Corey has a deep background in biology and ecology, and he's a macroecologist, studies large-scale patterns in ecology and evolution. And if you read any of his over 100 papers, quite prolific for his stage, you will see that he really balances excellent knowledge of really careful statistical and analytical approaches with the use of large-scale data sets and to test both new and classic theory in ecology and evolution with relevance to conservation. If you read some of those papers, you will also find the answers to questions like, how many birds are there in the world? Are widespread species abundant? And can we quantify the abundance of species based on their species interactions from citizen science data? So he was previously, before at UF, he was a Marie Curie fellow, postdoctoral fellow at the University of New South Wales in Australia, where he did his PhD as well. And he has a Florida history. He was a master's student at Florida Atlantic University. So I will turn it over to Corey with great thanks for making the trip.
When we left FAU, my wife and I were like, we're never moving back to South Florida. And we did. It was like 7 years later. So yeah, but thank you, Josh. Thanks for having me up. It wasn't too bad of a drive. Like, it's really close. I've been out in this area quite a bit, but never actually in Archibald. So it's pretty cool to be here. Yeah, so my talk is going to be all over the place. So we'll see. I do have some Florida stuff at the end that I really hope I make it to. So we'll find out. But I went with a broad title, Leveraging Large-Scale Participatory Science Data for Local and Global Scale Biodiversity Research. What I'm going to start with a really small story, maybe. And that's about this bird. This is a black-backed oriole. This bird is endemic to Mexico, so it's only found in Mexico. But back in February of 2017, this bird somehow made its way to a backyard in Pennsylvania. And so the homeowners were typical kind of like, they liked the birds in their backyard, right? So they like take photos of the birds on the bird feeder. They found this one, they posted it on Facebook, and they're like, what is this bird? This doesn't quite look like our, Baltimore oriole. So someone chimed in and they're like, oh, that's a black-backed oriole. It's the first time it's ever been documented in the ABA area. Can we come and see it? And they're like, yeah, of course you can come see it. So then the next morning, they woke up and their driveway was chockers full of people, right? They had no idea what they were getting into. And this is pretty standard. I don't know how many like bird people there are, but then you get the same puns in the literature about bird watchers flocking to neighborhoods to find these rare birds. And this was interesting because these homeowners were really curious about this like human component. And they're like, man, why are so many people coming to our house? And so they started a logbook. And I was in Australia doing my PhD at the time, but the birding world is unsurprisingly pretty small. So through a friend of a friend, I was getting text messages like every other day of like this logbook. I'm like, this is really cool. So we started documenting it, and it turns out one bird brought in over 1,800 visitors to this like tiny backyard in somewhat rural Pennsylvania. We did some kind of like pseudo-economic analysis and found that event was about $220,000 of like economic impact. Now that's just a small story to just set the stage. And the really important thing that I really like to make at this point is there's a lot of people that value nature and value documenting and observing nature. And so that's where, this participatory science comes from people, right? That's at the heart of observation and observing. I'm sure everybody in the room that works at Archibald, right? Like, you must have liked nature at some point in your past to actually end up in this career path. And so there's a lot of people that value nature. And so they go and they use these citizen science apps, and that creates big data, right? So this is a map of GBIF, the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. This is the largest biodiversity data clearinghouse in the world. Over 2 billion observations of all living, organisms. And I'm going to talk about a couple citizen science projects that I'm going to kind of hit on throughout my talk. So eBird, who has an eBird account? Okay, that's pretty good. Launched in 2002 by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And this is like the epitome of big data in my mind. The rate at which these data are increasing throughout the month of May, average 7 observations per second, sustained throughout the entire month, right? It's this, classic peak of neotropical migrants, and everybody's out ticking birds and submitting lists. That's like a lot of data that you have to handle, and a lot of data that you can answer ecological questions with. And then iNaturalist, who has an iNaturalist account? Okay, almost everybody. Who submitted an iNaturalist observation today? Okay, nice, the new person. That's cool. That's cool. Yeah, so iNaturalist, is kind of a little bit more broad, takes all taxa. I'm not going to talk too much about the ins and outs of it. Sounds like everybody has an account, but I will just kind of give a brief overview. 3 key pieces of data. What is it? Where is it? When is it there? What is it? You're right, like a species. This is slightly outdated. They're closing in on 500,000 documented species through these digital vouchers. What is it? Any lepidopterists in the room? Southern skipperling. I think someone was about to mumble it. Where is it? So this is in my backyard, in plantation, so not too far. If you're ever nearby, please feel free to stop in. So you get this information at multiple levels of where it is, right? So I know it's in my backyard, but where is it more broadly? Each red dot is a location. And so there's a few, like it's not a common butterfly in Broward County. I don't think there's anywhere where I could guarantee you could get it if you're interested in county level lepidopteran listing. But, so I was happy that, this is a good butterfly. But then where is it broadly, right? Like all of a sudden you can quickly see that it, is a southeastern range species just from people submitting observations. And then the last thing is, when is it there? All right, so this is a typical phenogram, time, number of observations. It's a fall flying species. Keep in mind, this is averaged across the entire range. So there's going to be some, geographic variability within there. But still, nevertheless, you can kind of get this very basic natural history in a matter of seconds, just from everybody uploading these observations of one species. And so this, eBird and iNaturalist that I'm going to come back to, this data in GBIF is a 12-fold increase since 2007. So the rate at which data are being mobilized is really increasing. But 80% of the data since 2010 has come from citizen science projects, right? And those eBird and iNaturalist are the two that I guess I can say, professionally and personally, I invest a lot of time and effort into. So lots of data, but what is it good for, right? This is how I feel. I don't know if there's any Sunny fans, but this is how I often feel. Because, and you'll see probably from this talk, that my research is all over the place. It's very not connected. But the one thing that connects it is data and citizen science, right? So those are the 2 themes that kind of run throughout most of my research. And I also try to think about this, right? I think a lot of people spend time here, thinking about, we have lots of data, more data than we've ever had in the past. But very few people are thinking about 10, 15, 20 years from now. If these data, even if these data plateau and stabilize, what are we going to be doing these data from a monitoring, conservation, application side of view? That's where I try to spend some of my time thinking of this part here. And so, like a good little academic, I went away and I wrote this thought paper of hey, let's try to organize what the heck I'm going to do if I ever get a job. And so this was titled 3 Frontiers for the Future of Biodiversity Research Using Citizen Science Data. So that's kind of how I'm going to structure the most of the remainder of my talk, are these 3 different frontiers. The first one is capitalizing on secondary data collection. I just went through what the primary data from my iNaturalist is, right? The what, when, where, right? When someone submits an observation, they want to know what it is and when it is there, right? That's the primary data. But when someone takes a photo, what do we have? A fiery skipper, right? Most people are probably focused on the fiery skipper, not the interaction with Ricardia, right? So there's a lot of information that's buried in these photographs that I think are just now starting to be able to be tapped, right? A predation event on a northern pike. This was in Greece, and I just thought it was I jumped out of the car to get this. So Mediterranean mantis, but it was on an anthropogenic building, right? So like there's like just the fact that some species are using anthropogenic buildings and others aren't is some sort of, at some level, behavioral kind of natural history. So a case study, I know most people here probably do terrestrial things. We're gonna go to start in the marine environment. So the question was, can we quantify habitat information from my naturalist photographs? Right, so diving is super expensive, time consuming, highly skilled in order to be able to like recruit a pool of people to actually go and monitor the seafloor and habitat. There's all these photographs of fish. And so can you get at some level an understanding of the seafloor habitat, marine habitat from the backgrounds of these photographs? We took iNaturalist photographs and we compared those with Reef Life Survey, which is like a very standardized protocol where people are diving to actually monitor, marine habitat and marine fishes. And the first thing we did was like, well, how many of these photos can we even use? And it turns out this was 6 sites along the Eastern Australian coast. And it turns out, over 75% of the photos had some sort of, quote, usable information in the background of those photographs. We went through all those photos, and lo and behold, we had a really strong correlation between like these macro level habitat variables that you get from this standardized protocol and this like very arbitrary sampling, opportunistic sampling that comes from iNaturalist, extracting all that data from the background. Again, like, turf algae, macroalgae, coral, soft coral, like macro level stuff, but still you can have an understanding at a course level of the marine environment. Now, I say we, and that's like a very royal we, because an undergrad actually went through all those photos. And they, so that was very labor intensive. And so the question is like, what other secondary data is available and how do you get it, right? Like, so a lot of the machine learning has been focused on that primary data point, like what is this organism? Very little has been focused on what is this organism and what's that other organism that it's landed on or interacting with. So that's kind of what I think some of the next steps are from a, big picture macro scale. But we have a few things going on with interaction networks and trying to think about like ground truthing the, niches of butterflies and other insects to see what can you get from the literature and what can you get from iNaturalist photographs? Because in theory, you probably have more photographs of monarchs than we've ever had in our life, right? Like more studied than we've ever been able to study in the cumulative lifetime. So you'd imagine that the niche is probably broader from the iNaturalist photographs than what we might think from the literature. The second frontier is estimating species abundances in space and time. I like counting birds. I've always been obsessed with like numbers. And so like I'm, when I see a flock of birds, I want to know how many are in there. And most of what we think about in ecology is focused on relative abundance. Very little is focused on absolute abundance. And that's because it's really hard to get and hard to estimate. There's multiple statistical steps to get there. The data are super time consuming because you need, standardized point counts with distance sampling. There's all these reasons of why absolute abundance is hard to get. But nevertheless, I was like, well, can we do this? And applicable at large spatial scales, and how might this be possible? I really think there's only one way, and that's, eBird. So we had 2 ambitious goals. One was to estimate the global abundance for almost all the world's bird species, and then ask kind of like sum that up and say how many individual birds are there in the world. So we set down this path, and I won't bore you too much with like the predictive mean matching and some of the statistical steps that we did to kind of fill missing data, but I'll go from a very high level. What we did is we grabbed all the noisy citizen science data, all these biases, right? Like I did a checklist only because I saw scrub jay and it was a bird, right? Like that's the only reason I actually submitted one when Josh and I were driving around. So that's a bias right there towards this like charismatic bird that's a bird. So this data is super noisy, but then we grabbed true density, and you can think about this as like the best available data for 724 species across the world, highly biased towards the US. And those were spatially repeating for some species like northern cardinal. We had like county level estimates throughout most of the eastern United States coming from the BBS data. And we put that into one model to basically understand the difference between this noisy data and this true density. And the idea is to take those 724 species, train all the species, and then make predictions. And we use some traits to try to help us do that. The best way to think about this is, so if we all walked out side and there was a flock of 30 large pink flamingos, I don't want to be overconfident, but I'm fairly confident everybody in here would detect those birds, hopefully. But then like the one yellow-throated warbler that calls as it flew out of a palm tree, like maybe only Sahas and his team is going to detect, right? So there's like these large differences. And so what we try to do is like, those are our hypotheses of what impacts this relationship, right? Of this noisiness versus what's true. And so we threw those all into a massive model, gathered a bunch of traits, and that's as much as I'll talk about the methods. And then here's the answer. So this is like the first ever global species abundance distribution. For absolute abundance for, again, not all the bird species, but we ended up at 9,700. There's about 10,300-ish, depending on taxonomy and when you're looking at it. And so this is, for those who don't know, a species abundance distribution. So like the abundance estimate is here. The number of species that fall in that bin is on this axis. And the main takeaway here is there's relatively few abundant species and many rare species. So almost 1,200 species had a global population of 5,000 individuals or less. The key there is kind of thinking about, well, why are they rare, right? Like Mother Nature just likes rare things. Like a lot of these species are on one island top in the Philippines or Indonesia. But then there's other species like whooping crane that shouldn't be on that side, right? That are anthropogenically caused to be rare. And so we didn't go into that at all. It was just is much more a methodsy type paper and thinking about how you can use this data. And then the big answer, we summed all this up and we ended up with about 50 billion birds as like our total estimate. For any math wizards, you can see 50 billion is the median, and then the mean is 428 billion. So basically that just means there's a lot of uncertainty. But nevertheless, like we ended up going with the 50 billion number, and that's the number we like went with in the press, and that's the one that got kind of picked up. So that's, you know, 6.25-ish birds for every human on the planet. And then the top 4 globally abundant species with the uncertainty here is house sparrow, European starling, ring-billed gull, and barn swallow. They mostly make sense, except for ring-billed gull. Massive uncertainty. Turns out like gulls and colonial nesting birds just didn't perform well in our model. But that's a whole other story for a beer. Anyway, so next steps in global abundance modeling. You know, I think our main thing here is thinking about like how you can refine these models. Your ability to predict is constrained by your training data, right? We only had 724 species that we use to train these models. You know, it's not that much harder to get more. Another thing that I'd really like to do is like downgrade that. Like we used 5-degree grid cells across the world. So absolutely massive grid cells throughout the world. I think you could probably do something like this throughout the state of Florida or a much more fine-grained domain. And so those are the two things. And then, you know, thinking about other taxa, like this is a dream that's multiple years away, but there's a lot of data on like butterfly abundance. And there's a lot of observations on butterflies in these citizen science data sets. So I don't think it's impossible. But yeah, that's further afield. Okay, so the last frontier that I wanted to talk about was what I call sampling the undersampled. So I've already talked a little bit about some of these biases. And so, you know, this is a very standard kind of figure that just shows the global biases in our understanding of biodiversity, right? So on this panel, you just have taxonomic group and total number of observations on a log 10 scale. So we have a lot more data on birds than we do on anything else. Here you have geographic biases based on GDP, total area, and per human population, right? And so the standard biases towards the global north, Australia pops out pretty well. We don't know a lot about Africa, Southeast Asia, large parts of South America to some extent, right? So this is like pretty well known. And these biases kind of are generated at many different levels. And I'm one of those, right? So I said I'm a somewhat serious birder. My wife would say obsessed. So this is like the one thing, this is like my very humble brag. And by humble, I mean not humble at all. But so 2,312 days ago, someone said to me, they're like, did you know Ebert had a checklist streak? I'm like, no. I'm like, they're like, what's your checklist streak? I looked, I'm like 10 days. I'm like, that's weak. They're like, mine's at 30. And that was like, yeah, that was over 2,300 days ago. So like, I'm a little competitive at times as well, right? And so, but I go birding every day. I need to submit a checklist. And the problem is, I don't always know where to go, right? Like, I've had this dream of like, I wish someone would just text me and like, hey, on the way to your office this morning, you should check out this park because no one's been there in 3 weeks. And that could be like a very valuable data point. This hasn't quite taken place yet, but this was like the dream I had, right? So I wrote this up into a little bit of a paper. I'm like, it honestly launched me into like a whole interesting career path of like, or career research path that like, how do we know what is valuable data, right? It's a really complicated question. So how do I make my data count? That's the question I was interested in. And I realize that's quite selfish, but yes. And so here's an example. So you want to sample for species richness estimation. How do we know what samples are valuable? So here's a city, 2 parks, equidistant from the city. For whatever reason, more people go to Park B than they go to Park A. We have this thing called completeness. And so because more people go to Park B, we like, you can think of completeness as like, we think we know 75% of the species that exist at Park B, right? Compared to Park A, there's only 25%. And so if I asked you, where should the priority be? Everybody would say Park A, but I'm just setting you up. Because what if we knew more information, right? Like, what if it's more complicated than that? What if Park A is actually under a conservation easement for the next 40 years, whereas Park B is set for your latest political figure to make a new golf course, right? Like, you never know what's going to happen. And this is a very potentially real scenario. And if that's the scenario, then I think the question becomes, well, actually that 25%, that's actually where that rare orchid is, or something that actually needs to be mitigated for, right? Like the 75% is really easy to get to at some level, but the last 25% is where the important stuff is. So then I think the priority should be potentially focused on Park B, right? Like in a way, like Park A can kind of wait. And so we took this and put this into a bit of a conceptual framework. So think of this average completeness or our knowledge, and then risk of habitat conversion on the other axis. And then that space is filled with sampling priority. And so high is yellow, low is purple. So like the highest, biodiversity data are most urgently needed up in this corner. They're already ready for the future down in this corner. And so the objective is to get something from this side of the one-to-one line to the other side of the one-to-one line. That was just a bit of a framework. We grabbed some real data at a global scale in really large hexagonal cells of completeness, and then habitat conversion, a paper by Allen et al. in PLOS Biology, where they have this kind of like high, medium, low, very coarse like risk of habitat classification in the future. And we ended up with 3,500 grid cells, and this is what it looks like. Nothing terribly surprising, to be honest. And this paper, it's not my favorite paper because it's not where I wanted to go, right? Like, I think this is actually much, much more interesting at a local scale of like Park A versus Park B. At a global scale, we kind of know this, and I'm never going to advocate people should like fly to South America to go fill in completeness values. But if you happen to be there for ecotourism, co-benefits. So we kind of like, and I played around, I've written a few papers on this kind of like theoretical, like, hey, here's where we think sampling should take place by citizen scientists to help understand knowledge. That was just one example. There's a few other papers I've written. But then the question kind of remained like, well, does anybody actually care, right? Like, there's people that generate these data. Will they actually do it? So we turned and we said, well, will it work? Because up until this point, this is probably in my PhD-ish, like toward the end of my PhD, I really just sat behind the computer screen. I got data from the cloud, from GBIT, but there's all these people generating these data. Now, granted, I do generate a lot of data. I'm a fairly heavy INET user and stuff, but like that was very separate from my research. And so once I was finishing my PhD, I kind of made a cognizant decision of like, I actually want to bring that into my research. I think it's really, really important to understand like how people are generating these data and why they're generating these data. And so a PhD student in Australia kind of kicked off some research. This is with a project called Frog ID. And we basically asked them like, hey, why do you contribute to citizen science? Like, why do you contribute to this citizen science project, Frog ID? The number one kind of reason was contribute. This is your typical Likert scale, like strongly agree to strongly disagree. And this is like a Likert plots. This is how the data come out. It's a very important, is this like teal color? Not important at all, is this red color. Overwhelmingly, we had about 1,200 total respondents. Overwhelmingly, contributing to science was like the number one reason why people submitted observations to Frog ID, right? They want to do well, good for conservation. Getting outside and connecting with nature, education, some of these other things as well, but that contributing to science. So if that's true, then it kind of stands to reason like, well, hey, if we want you to sample 5 kilometers further from your house, will you do it? And so that was our next question. We had a spatial component and a temporal component. So we basically asked them, like, hey, if we tell you where to go sample, will you do it? If we tell you when to go sample, will you do it, right? Like maybe there's critical times you need to sample during their peak calling period, these kinds of things for frogs. And overwhelmingly, the spatial and temporal patterns were like pretty much identical, but you know, high 80, 90% said that if they knew that information, that they would adopt this like different sampling protocol. It's not protocol, is not the right word, but time and place. That was a survey, a quantitative survey where we asked participants, but we probably all filled these out and, you know, like, will it really work? Like I say, I'm going to do a lot of things. Like I have a long to-do list, but like, will it actually happen? So that was our next question. And to do that, we kind of developed a pseudo-experimental like approach where Frog ID was already taking place. It's a very successful citizen science project. So we a priori got 6 different, what they call them local government areas. It's parallel to counties here. So we basically chose like 6 different local government areas and we classified them into 3 groups. One was a control, and we kind of classified them based on like size, number of frogs, number of current participants in Frog ID as best as we could. One was a control, two areas were control. One was a website, so we built them a website to tell them where they should go sampling. And then the third was a website and a leaderboard. So we built them a website to tell them where they should go sampling. And then we also gave them a leaderboard that told them where the most valuable samples were, and they could like track their value to science through that leaderboard. This is just a quick video of the website. So the underlying kind of question here, because even this was difficult, right? Like, well, what's the question? There's so many different questions for science that are valuable. So we went with the tried and true species richness estimation, like the simplest and you know most easily understood. And we use species accumulation curves. And so basically, a species accumulation curve is how close we think we are to that completeness level. And so we took the inverse of that as a priority score. Now, the key is this can change, right? Because if someone goes to a cell, submits a crap ton of records, then actually that priority should decrease, right? Because we actually just gained a lot of information from that cell, potentially depending on what they reported. This was like a live experiment throughout an entire year. I'll skip that one. This is the same, but just with the leaderboard. And so, you know, there's a lot of leaderboards and gamification in the citizen science projects, but most of them are focused on like number of records, number of species, and that doesn't actually necessarily translate to kind of value for science, right? That can just create redundancy or potentially gaps in the data. And so this was our leaderboard test, you know, so we gave 1 point for low priority. Oh yeah, we binned them, right? We didn't want to do like something continuous. We just ended up categorizing them to low, medium, high kind of sampling priority. And then, yeah, 1, 2, 3, pretty standard. And then we invited people, human ethics as well, and all that fun stuff. It's kind of complicated because the project's already taking place, and this is like a separate project, right, of this bigger project. So we had to send reminder emails because people could join the project but not know about this like beta test of like where you should go sampling or this external website. And then here are the results. So this is the total percentage of samples for this year long. We updated it every 2 weeks relative to what was presented throughout the year long sample, right? And so this is like somewhat complicated, but here we have the 2 controls, the map, which is the website, and then the map and the leaderboard. So the first thing I want you to do is just follow like the low priority cells. In the control, the majority across both of them was in the low priority sampling. That's a group we didn't talk to, we didn't tell them anything. They just kind of did their own thing. But in all the things that we like played with, the low priority was much lower. And then look at the opposite, right? High priority. In these 3 out of the 4, most of the samples were in high priority compared to the 2 controls, relatively low. This one I hate. So we were like not sure, and we had like this quite lengthy back and forth with a reviewer, and it turns out it was a super user that just happened to live in a medium priority cell, and they just went nuts every night recording frogs like crazy, and they really messed with the results. And one of the reviewers was like, you should remove that. And then we kind of held our ground. We're like, well, you know what? This is actually part of the citizen science data. Like, these super users exist, so we kind of want it to be robust, but it makes telling this story harder. So sometimes I regret that. But anyway, so that's basically the story. Like, it was one person that kind of flew this medium priority up high. So we published that paper in Bioscience titled Experimental Evidence that Behavioral Nudges in Citizen Science Projects Can Improve Biodiversity Data. Right? So there's a lot of literature, turns out, on behavioral nudge theory and like how and when and how people can change behavior. So, real world example. So far, it's like, okay, we think they'll do it. Like, what is a possibility of when this could work? Any NEPA? People are familiar with NEPA? Not okay. So NEPA is out of the Executive Office of the White House. It's the National Environmental Policy Act. It is the federal regulating mitigation process, right? Environmental impact assessment. Anything that takes place on federal land, infrastructure, road, whatever, or full-on development has to go through a NEPA process. It's been in the literature a lot, or not literature, but been in the news a lot with Biden and before he left office. So we looked at this NEPA document. We looked at all NEPA documents from 2012 to 2022. And these are the environmental impact statements. We're just like curious, like, how often are citizen science data being used in these very, very heavily policy influenced documents? And so these were our search terms: citizen science, community science, eBird, and iNaturalist. We searched almost 1,400 documents, of which 228 were used in the analysis. So we classified them, we qualitatively coded them and classified them to 4 different definitions. And I'll go through each of these. The first is nondescript. It kind of wasn't really clear. Here's an example. These are all examples pulled from actual NEPA policy documents. So they said iNaturalist law, but that was kind of it. Like, didn't really give much more context to that. The other was suggestive. There was quite a few that would say, hey, you could use eBird in the future to monitor the impact of this road development. I'd like to go back and see how many actually do that, but that's another discussion. The other one was indirect. So very general statements like red knots are restricted to ocean coasts, cite eBird. Doesn't really have any bearing on the actual policy itself. It's just kind of used as kind of contextual information. And then the last one is direct, right? So citizen science methods were directly applied to kind of identify the species of interest in relation to mitigation / development / whatever took place in that policy document. And there's 2 types: presence and absence. We'll come back to those. Here's the trend from 2012 to 2022. More and more of these documents are using citizen science, or at least mentioning it, right? So it's becoming increasingly popular through time. The majority of those are direct, using it in a very real way to make some sort of implied statement about the policy that's being under consideration. So 64% direct, 19% indirect, 20% suggested, mostly eBird, right? 87% eBird, only 6% iNaturalist. I think this is going to change a lot in the near future. I think if you repeat that in 5 years, I think there's going to be a lot more naturalist usage because it's kind of coming online where it's possible now. So I wanted to go back to this presence versus absence. Presence is relatively straightforward, right? Like, hey, this animal or organism exists in our study area or was found because in general, if it's on eBird or if it's on iNaturalist, it's probably there. Absence, however, is frightening. So 12% of all of the environmental impact statements use no citing of a species as evidence of absence of that species, right? So the example on the previous screen was the Arkansas river shiner. So no records of Arkansas river shiner have been submitted to iNaturalist from within or close to the landscape analysis area. Whoa, but there's only 1 record in all of iNaturalist, right? And there's no mention of any kind of statistical uncertainty about this, right? This is really scary. This is a super, super rare fish. So it's not great. And so the paper really, this was published just last year in Frontiers in the Ecology and Environment. And it was more like, hey, this is a thing that's taking place. We should probably start to talk about it and think about it in a regulatory kind of way, because these data are absolutely useful. but you need to know about appropriate statistical analysis to make it meaningful. And then I'm personally like, consider the extent that participants are willing to share data. I'm really on the fence here, right? Like, so there's this part of me that if you told me there's a golf course going in, next door, and like a nature preserve, I'm like, let's go nuts, let's get our black lights, let's just go crazy, let's just bioblitz the crap out of that. But then you told me, oh, but consulting firm X is actually going to use that data, make a pretty penny to generate a report. I'm like, oh, like that's a little bit weird. And so I'm not sure how I feel. Like I'm genuinely unsure how I feel about that. And I think that there's some important considerations to dive into, like how and why people are using these data as to whether or not these should and how they should become a part of regulatory policy documents in the future. And that was at a national level, right? That's all, like that's the easiest way. We tried at localized levels, but it's hard to get some of that kind of information of like when and where developments are going in, because it's county, state, municipality, all have different codes, all have different regulations that need to be met. So NEPA was kind of the easiest entryway into that. Okay, so that's my typical kind of spiel that I went through fairly quickly on purpose, because now I'm in Florida. So nothing of that had anything to do with Florida. So then 2 years ago, 2 and a little bit, I started at UF, assistant professor in wildlife ecology and conservation. So I just want to touch on 2 quick examples of stuff I have going, and then talk a little bit more about my position in the end. And so, we got to Florida. Oh, and I know, part of the reason too, I gave a seminar like, I don't know, 2-3 years ago in Alabama, I think. And it basically ended, where I just ended. And then someone raised their hand and they're like, well, actually around here, we call it citizen science data. And I'm like, oh, interesting, right? Because I'm like building my whole career on like the value of these data. And I'm like, man, that was just right to the chest. And it still haunts me. And so I'm like, okay, well, you know what? Maybe I need to understand, like, what do people actually think about this data and how is it being used throughout the state of Florida? So that's where this project was kind of born. So we surveyed practitioners throughout the state of Florida. We kind of got 67, we emailed all 67 counties at various different kind of like sustainability positions. Anybody that might be able to use iNaturalist or citizen science in like sort of either an environmental education context, like, hey, come learn about biodiversity, or a natural resources management context. And we were looking at, thoughts and attitudes. We purposely tried to get non-citizen science users to kind of understand, like, well, the people that aren't using it, why aren't they using it? To try to understand this a little bit more. We had, and FWC was obviously a big partner. We worked with them on this paper. And so because they are kind of like the biggest state agency, and this is recording. Also looked at University of Florida Extension, county level, municipality, FDEP, and then kind of other organizations as well. So we have 232 survey responses, which we're like pretty happy with. Like I was looking at like 100. I was like, oh, I'll be happy to get 100. And I think that's publishable and like enough of a sample size. So I was really happy at 200. And we had 25% that don't use it. So because I was really worried we'd be skewed towards like 90% of like, hey, we already use this. So we had a fairly reasonable sample size. And the questions, citizen science is a way to accomplish high quality public engagement, monitoring, and research. So public engagement and monitoring were always higher than research, right? So that kind of hurt a little bit. I do a little bit of research with these data, so I'm like, okay, that's fine. But it just means there's more and more to kind of like think about and how to work on. And then the other way was, more questions or motivations were create a sense of community, increase public understanding, increase scientific literacy, and engage members of underrepresented communities. And it was generally like strongly agree. So people have, and there was no real difference between someone that already uses citizen science in their job and someone that doesn't use citizen science in their job. That was like fairly good news, I guess. Like people generally think this is useful to think about. And then we asked, indicate your level of agreement. Citizen science projects often require specialized knowledge or training, kind of mixed. And then citizen science data are as reliable as data collected from professional scientists. Pretty negative, right? Fairly negative, which is, to me, kind of interesting. Yeah. And so the takeaways here were kind of the challenges due to citizen science data, lack of staff or volunteer support. And a lot of that is like a statistical support, because a lot of the ways to use these data are understanding the biases and how to account for those biases and how to frame your questions that are robust to set biases to some extent, or like random sampling to kind of get away from some of these biases. There's lack of funding to support more projects for monitoring these citizen science, because it's not free. I mean, you get to a economy of scale where like it's cost effective, but it's not necessarily free, right? Like all these things cost money to store data, technology, et cetera. Key needs include tools and technology, guidance on incorporating citizen science, training in the collection methods, and then additional people obviously talk about funding a lot. This isn't surprising. So that whole takeaway was kind of interesting. I mean, I'm still left, and this is like very fresh. Like we haven't submitted this yet. We're just kind of finishing up analysis. I'm still left like, man, there's a lot of people that don't think these data are that good. And I've written too many papers that are basically like compare citizen science data, compare professional data, and you generally get the same answer. And so we worked on another one. So this was a master's student of mine is working on a project right now. How does citizen science compare with state agency data? So like all state lands are mandated to monitor and inventory the natural resources. And so every FWC land, wildlife management area, every state park, they all have an individual plan. That's like I think it's a 10-year horizon. And in that plan is like, here's all the species we documented. It's supposed to be an inventory. A naturalist and eBird are very popular. And so our general idea was, well, state parks are really well visited. So can we see like how much of these data, like how do they compare? We only ended up with 39 state parks managed by FDEP. We went down some rabbit holes of getting data. The eBird on naturalist data is really easy because it's already there. But the other data are not always in forms that are easy to get. So we ended up with 39 state parks in one district and that are managed by FDEP, and we got the species lists for those state parks. We harmonized the taxonomy to see what's the difference between, INET eBirds and science in general versus the state park inventory. This is the species count. So this is like total raw richness. So species count from FDEP minus species count from citizen science, right? And this is a histogram for the number of parks. So you can see there's a few massive outliers, right? Because even the state parks are like, it's very heterogeneous in how much they're visited and how much data exists from those state parks. Here's the total, here's it breaking down by taxonomic group. So the green is FDEP only, blue is both, and purple is citizen science only. And then here's 3 different state parks. Payne's Prairie. So I guess the main takeaway here is there's a lot of data that you can get, like species that are added to inventories when taken from citizen science. And I would say the next takeaway is that's most evident for insects. Nobody cares about insects, unfortunately, right? Like very little regulatory power. Anyway, so that's the main takeaway. Here's one state park, Payne's Prairie, lots of insects, right? So almost 700 insecta species that haven't been documented, like on the inventory that is produced through the state legislature. And then here's just the IUCN conservation status. Critically endangered, lots of FDEP, right? So no part of me is like saying that like we don't need professional monitoring. I think it's really, really important, but I think we can fill in a lot of gaps, especially for the common species, using some of these other databases, right? So this is the main takeaway here of like, hey, actually, all the critically endangered species, which isn't that many to be fair, but like still, those are mostly picked up through targeted efforts from FDEP. Okay, so conclusions, skip that slide. I guess one of my main takeaways is, hopefully it's evident that I've really made a weird shift in my career so far. It's like, I want people to be part of the equation, like they are from citizen science, they generate the data. So part of what I do is try to think holistically, like how do you get people to generate data and understand how they generate data and how does that influence our ecological understanding of biodiversity in space and time. I wanted to do a little bit of advertising just in the last couple minutes. My position is really cool and unique. So I have a 70% research appointment and a 30% extension appointment. Extension, does anybody know what extension is? A little bit, okay. So extension is, I barely know what extension is. Extension is outreach. And so, but in the middle of that is citizen science, eBird, iNaturalist. So I do a lot of work kind of using these data to think about conservation, monitoring biodiversity. But part of that is completing this loop of community engagement, developing workshops, outreach material that can help fill that loop. So I write some of these documents like how to go mothing, right? Like relatively basic. It's really targeted at somebody who is an amateur and like, when do you throw up a blacklight? What blacklight should you use? How do you actually do that? And then why you should submit your observations to iNaturalist. It's not about like how to identify moths, it's how to find moths. We wrote one for herping. We also wrote one for hoppers. So plant hoppers, leaf hoppers. So we're kind of like slowly going through taxonomic groups. And then my last advertisement is one of the things that I do at UF is organize the DeLuca Preserved BioBlitz. It's a piece of property not that far from here in theory as a crow flies. And so our 4th annual is Friday, March 7th. And it's basically, I kind of want it to be like the biggest BioBlitz that there is and just like really just freaking get everything there. Anyway. Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Corey. We have 10 minutes maybe for questions, and we'll that's it. I'll bring you the mic. You got there first.
Very cool talk. Also, Marco has research at DeLuca, you didn't know, and we had 60 people here from IFAS for an event earlier today.
Okay.
I really like all of this. So the question I have a question about ethics, which is like, what's the conversation going on about using data collected by potentially unethical situations, or nudging people to go places that might be sensitive and they don't have training because they're not professionals on how to not step on rare stuff.
Is the last thing you said, is that what you mean by unethical?
I mean, so people are taking pictures and stuff, and
Mhm.
assume that they're not hurting or not harming the environment or the animals, but they're not trained professionals. So there could, I know with wildlife photography, for instance, there's real issues with people wanting to photograph where their birds are going into nesting areas and disturbing them. That could happen with people contributing to citizen science projects too.
Sure.
So I'm just kind of wondering what's the conversation about that? How do we make sure that more people are incentivized to participate in science and doing it in an ethical way?
That's a good question, but I don't, I guess I don't know if there's a conversation to have like as an answer, I think it just depends on the training and but a lot of the people that submit a lot of observations to iNaturalist and stuff are skilled amateurs. I really don't like the distinction between professional and amateur. Like I don't think it should exist. I think it's silly, but I understand the purpose of the question. I mean, the one thing with iNaturalist, they automatically buffer a lot of observations, but that's more about poaching. So I think that's the far end of unethicalness. It's a good question. Yeah, there's a lot of conversations, but I don't have I don't know if there's a single conversation about how to do it. Yeah.
I'm going to go with Fred and everything is possible.
The American Birding Association does have a statement about ethics of birding.
Yeah.
And tell you not to play your tape recorder too much and so on. So I think other organizations are probably developing similar guidelines.
Yeah, for sure. These exist. I mean, these exist everywhere, but you're always going to have bad actors, and so I don't know how you, filter that. But yeah, like ABA, yeah, absolutely, yeah.
I was really interested with that comparison with the state parks, which is citizen science. And I was curious if you thought about, or maybe even have data on how the pros are engaging with citizen science apps. So like the people that are out there for their jobs that are also just documenting stuff online now. Any insights to be gained from?
Yeah, I don't have any data on it. It'd be nice to have data on it, but I would say it's probably quite few and far between. Where like I think that's just the nature of INAT. Like there's relatively few heavy hitters, and so it's statistically unlikely that they happen to be working for a state park. But it's awesome if they do, right? Because they can generate a lot of cool data. But I don't know of any data or like specific insights on that. Yeah.
Thanks for a great talk. Two quick questions. One, first is why wasn't the red bellied pea the most abundant bird? You probably haven't gotten that.
Yeah.
And the second is, what does this tell us? Like, how do we think about access to a lot of these sites that we don't know information for? So that all these wildlife management areas are often not accessible to a lot of people. And so, are there ways to increase access to better document practice?
So your second question, I feel like that's some kind of conservation ethos question there of whether or not it's altruistic or not. So I don't really have an answer. Selfishly, I'd love access to everywhere, but I understand why it doesn't exist. I think a lot of the gaps in these areas that don't have access, I think can be filled in statistically, right? Like everything can be remote sensed. Well, I mean, not the actual biodiversity, but like you can remote sense a lot of stuff. And so you can get enough data from similar sites to probably make reasonable predictions in those unaccessed sites. The red-billed quelea, yeah, it's funny because we went down a couple different paths on that, and one was like a phylogenetic imputation method, and it actually did come out as the most abundant. So it was close, but I think the reason it didn't come out in the way we ended up is because the variability, right? And so we use relative abundance, and so because you get these like freaking massive flocks, and then a lot of checklists with 5. Right, like I was just there in December, and like most of my checklists have 5 to 10. I never saw 20,000, and so it skews it down, and we just didn't have the training data to like unskew that. Yeah.
So I don't know that there's a way that other firm observations. Wondering like how big of a bottleneck do you think that is in terms of that data being used by scientists, and how reliable is that overall?
Yeah, so I didn't go into detail, but like the way INAT works is it's a community-driven approach, and so you need 2/3 or more than 2/3 of people to agree on an identification, and then it's flipped to research grade, and then those research grade observations, depending on the license that the user chooses, goes to GBIF. And so the research grade, research grade is research grade. Like in my mind, like that's off the shelf, close to ready. You need to do some cleaning and filtering of like geolocation accuracy and other things. They've done some tests recently that like 95% of research grade is like fairly accurate. So it's pretty high, and it's going to vary by group, right? Like birds, it's probably 99-point-something%. Other groups, like moths is going to be quite different, especially, micro moths, like, so it's microlepts, like, so it's going to vary a lot. But I think it's essential, right? Like, and one of my pleas that I probably should have added was like for identifiers. I think the bottleneck is identifications, right? Like the number of people using iNaturalist is just like massively and just uptaking, but the number of experts that are there putting their time and energy in is minimal, isn't to me what it could be. Like one of the worst things I see on social media is like someone will take like a screenshot of iNaturalist and they'll be like, oh, look at this snail. This is only in the East Coast, but look at all these records in California. This data are rubbish. And like the amount of time that they took to take the screenshot and make a social media post, they probably could have just fixed the records in iNaturalist themselves. Right? Like, so it's like you are the one with the domain knowledge. So it's like the more you put into it, the more you get out. That's a whole soapbox. I'm sorry. I'll stop. But I've written a whole paper on that and solved benefits of contributing to iNaturalist for through identification. And that's where my soapbox really is.
You talked a little bit about gamification and super users in the Afghanistan response. Were you worried about super users once there was a more competitive environment?
No,
And was that a phenomenon you observed other times where maybe two or a small group of people were steering the data, or was that just a one-off?
it's a pretty standard like rule in these data sets. Like generally, 90% of the data come from 10% of the users. Right? Like I mean, that's quite rough and a little stereotypical, but that's a pretty general trend in most of these data sets that are generated through this. I don't know if that answers your question, but like, yeah. God, there's a lot of questions. Jeez, okay. I mean, this is fine. I should have talked longer.
Your talk. I'm interested in scientists who are using these data. Kind of using or you in, are there other scientists who are using it at the scale and intensity that you're using it? Using things like iNaturalist and eBird. I imagine it's different for the two.
Yeah.
Popularity among researchers.
Yeah. So, I mean, yes. But I feel like I too often live in an academic bubble. But I would say it's increasing. So there's about 1,200 publications that have used eBird data now. We actually have a current review paper under review on iNaturalist, and there's 11,000 hits in Google Scholar, of which we got to about 6,000 articles, of which about 2,500 met our criteria. So like, and that's just freaking taken off. And I think it's going to continue to take off. But what I wish for me is like to work in bubbles that aren't academia as well, because I think there's a lot that can be done from a monitoring perspective that is missing potentially. And that's kind of the purpose of that one study, is to like try to find those gaps and like try to understand like what that landscape is that isn't academia and research per se, but more on the ground.
I'm actually going to take post prerogative and ask one last question, because I think it will be instructive for a lot of people in the room who may be thinking about graduate school or next career steps. You said you think about 20 years down the pipeline, what these data look like and how they get used. If you were going to design a graduate program for ecologists or ecologists and evolutionary biologists, how would you balance fieldwork skills, data collection skills with the huge amount of statistical knowledge that's needed to work with these data correctly?
How would you balance that? Do it all? No, it's a good question. Yeah, like if I was going to design a program, I think they're both equally important. So, you know, I contribute a lot to eBird. I contribute a lot to iNaturalist. And I think one of the thing that helps me personally, this is probably going too personal, but one of the things that helps me personally is like when I'm analyzing the data or working on a paper, like I kind of know the biases because I generate those biases, right? Like I am like the weirdo that gets the Bidens at the gas station because it's a new spot on my map, right? But it's only a Bidens because it's the easiest thing. It's like right there. I'm just like, yeah, sure, real quick, right? Like, so I know, like, and so I guess both. I don't know. Yeah, how would I design a program? We are teaching a course, community science for ecologists. That's like at UF this semester. That's like basically that, but not a program. Just one course of like all components: education, research, data analysis, kind of all of it at a very broad level.
Or, more conversation.